audience, including the use of signs and placards, as well as verbal outbursts, are a violation of the rules of the House. The purpose of this hearing is to shed light on anti-Semitism in Europe, especially the spike of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel on October 7th. I would also like to welcome the gentle lady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, who is joining us today. She will participate in today's hearing following all other members. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying before the subcommittee today. Anti-Semitism is a scourge in Europe and around the world that we must tackle head-on. After the murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, the world made a promise: never again. These words only have meaning if all of us are willing to act and stop evil. After years of rising anti-Semitism in Europe, we are seeing a terrifying surge in anti-Jewish hatred after Hamas's October 7th attack. In the 2 months since Hamas's massacre of over 1,200 men, women, and children, synagogues and other Jewish institutions have been burned. Jewish memorials vandalized. Jews attacked in their homes and on the street. This is not 1930s Germany. This is Europe in 2023. It is time to act on the words "never again," and the time to act is right now. And while anti-Semitism is a problem across the European political spectrum, I am deeply concerned by how anti-Semitic activity has penetrated the mainstream of the political left in Europe. Anti-Semitism used to be relegated to the fringes of the far left and the far right, but now we have started to see anti-Semitic rhetoric come from prominent mainstream leftist figures in Europe, including some that are in their country's governing coalitions. Anti-Semitism is beginning to infect wider swaths of Europe's political left. If this trend is not reversed, it could lead to a dangerous normalization of anti-Semitism in European politics. Russia and Iran are fanning the flames of anti-Semitism in Europe. Dating back to the Soviet era, Russia has amplified anti-Semitic narratives in Europe to sow chaos and confusion and to distract the West from Russia's other malign behavior. When he served as special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism during the Trump administration, one of our witnesses, Mr. Carr, correctly labeled Iran as the world's chief state sponsor of anti-Semitism. Iran promotes flagrant anti-Semitism in its public messaging and regularly provides a platform for European Holocaust deniers. Just like they are working together to destroy Ukraine, Russia and Iran are now working together to inflame anti-Semitism and to sow division. But anti-Semitism is not just a problem in Europe. Here at home, in our universities, anti-Semitism is rampant. Last week, 3 Ivy League presidents testified before Congress and refused to say that calling for the genocide of Jews is considered bullying or harassment. It is no wonder that Jewish students feel unsafe and threatened. Academia here in the United States and in Europe has a moral responsibility to make plain that they do not tolerate anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, what we are witnessing all too frequently is an abject failure of leadership in combating anti-Semitism at too many institutions. Regardless, it is my belief that we can work with our European allies to counter this threat and to protect Jewish communities. We must tackle this issue head-on and identify what needs to be done to combat and defeat anti-Semitism in Europe. The Chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, any statement that he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and for our witnesses, some of whom have traveled great distances to be here today. It's happening at a time when the Jewish people celebrate a festival of lights in Hanukkah, yet even those lights can't eclipse the seriousness of today's hearings. On October 7th, 2023, that date marked an inflection point in the fight against anti-Semitism here in the United States, in Europe, and around the world. The terrorist attacks by Hamas, which I wholeheartedly condemn, unleashed a fury of anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish communities. The scale of the anti-Semitism we've seen since October 7th and the variety of its the forms it takes, with swastikas drawn on our buildings, to threats on synagogues, to physical violence, as well as the spectrum of offensive and threatening comments and actions anywhere in between these acts, reminds us very clearly of the threats that Jewish people face on a daily basis. In response to the October 7th attack, the Biden administration and many governments in Europe, the focus of today's hearing, have been united in support of the Jewish people. I commend those governments, many of whom have had their own dark past with anti-Semitism. I commend those countries who have been vocal and who have worked to ensure both the physical and emotional security of Jewish communities. We must also be clear in our separation of the Jewish people from the State of Israel. Jews should never be held responsible for the actions of Israel, or any other government for that matter. Targeting Jewish communities with hate and violence is not defending the human rights, for instance, of Palestinians. It's anti-Semitism. Yet Jewish communities in Europe are feeling the impact of this most recent rise in anti-Semitism. Authorities in France and Germany and the United Kingdom and across Europe have recorded record numbers of anti-Semitic incidents. We must also acknowledge that inadequate data collection has resulted in numerous anti-Semitic attacks being ignored or not even being recorded. While we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th, the data shows that the threat of anti-Semitism in Europe is pervasive. Last year, a survey of 10 European countries, the Anti-Defamation League found that roughly 1 in 4 respondents harbored, quote, extensive classic anti-Semitic beliefs, unquote, including 37% of those respondents in Hungary, where Prime Minister Orban's backsliding government has cloaked his anti-Semitism in Hungarian nationalist rhetoric. Specifically, Orban has praised Hungary's ruler during the Second World War, who deported thousands of Jews who were later massacred, and who was an ally of Hitler as, quote, an exceptional statesman, unquote. A statement that's been condemned by the Anti-Defamation League, and at the same time, he's referred to his critics as crafty and speculative with money, clearly anti-Semitic tropes. We must also acknowledge that the U.S. is not immune to the threats posed by anti-Semitism. It's our obligation to call it out wherever it presents itself. As Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt says often, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine and the harbinger of hate and violence that extends to all minority groups around the world. It threatens our values, our democracies, and our very way of life. Thankfully, significant steps have been taken in the U.S. and Europe to combat anti-Semitism, and they should not go unrecognized. In 2021, for example, the European Commission published the first ever EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. As of July of this year, 17 EU member states have published their own national strategies on anti-Semitism, and 8 other member states are in the drafting process. In May of 2023, the Biden administration also introduced the United States National Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism, which not only recognizes anti-Semitism as a global problem, but charts a concrete path for increasing awareness of anti-Semitism, improving the safety of Jewish communities, and building a collective response, including with our European allies, response to the hate and violence espoused by anti-Semites. We've also acted here in Congress. In November, I introduced HRES 872, along with House Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism co-chair Brian Fitzpatrick, to reaffirm the need to work with Europe to combat anti-Semitism and fight hate wherever it's present. I thank my colleagues from both sides of the aisle who have co-sponsored, including Representatives Manning, Schneider, and Granger, who have worked for years on this issue. Of course, there's significant work still to be done, and I look forward to the testimonies of our witnesses to better understand the threat posed by anti-Semitism and how we can find, from transatlantic solutions, permanent ways to deal with what is a permanent threat to Jewish life around the world. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a panel of distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. Mr. Elon Carr is the Chief Executive Officer of the Israeli-American Council. Rabbi Abraham Cooper is the Associate Dean and Director of Global Social Action at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and also the Chair of the Commission on International Religious Freedom. Dr. Matthew Levitt is the Fromer Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Ms. Simone Rodan Ben-Zaken is the Managing Director of the American Jewish Committee, Europe. Thank you for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I will ask you to keep your verbal remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Carr for his opening statement.
Chairman Kean, Ranking Member Keating, honorable members, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today, and thank you for focusing on the crisis of rising anti-Semitism, which poses a threat not only to Jews, but to society itself. My name is Elon Carr, and I'm the CEO of the Israeli-American Council, the advocacy and mobilizing organization for the Israeli-American community. During the last administration, I served as the United States Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Members of Congress, anti-Semitism has been rising dramatically in much of the world over the last decade, and Europe is no exception. In 2018, the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency conducted a survey of Europe's Jews, and the results were alarming. 90% of those polled said that anti-Semitism was rising. 85% rated it as the biggest social or political problem in the country. 40% feared that they would be physically attacked within the year. Who could have imagined that less than 80 years since the end of the Holocaust, Jew hatred would be surging, even in the very countries where the Holocaust occurred? The October 7th pogrom in Israel dramatically accelerated the trends of the past decade. More than 1,000 anti-Semitic attacks occurred in France in the month after October 7th. In the first week following the Hamas massacre, Germany saw a 240% increase of such incidents. And in the 2 weeks after the massacre, the crimes against Jews in London jumped 1,350%. One might have thought that the mass murder and mass kidnapping of Israeli children, women, and men, often in acts of incomprehensibly sadistic cruelty, would have at least temporarily quieted the world's Jew haters. On the contrary, as Ranking Member Keating powerfully pointed out, the massacre catalyzed a global anti-Semitic frenzy in which Jews have been attacked, bullied, harassed, and in which genocide against Jews has been either openly or tacitly celebrated. 3 distinct extremist ideologies are driving this disturbing surge in Jew hatred, both in Europe and here at home. Racial supremacists on the far right see Jews and Jewish organizations as a threat to the cultural or religious purity of the West. Militant Islamists consider Jews to be dangerous heretics who have no place in society and certainly no place in the Middle East. And neo-Marxists on the radical left pervert concepts of social justice to define Jews as apex predators within an intersectional hierarchy of systemic oppression and racism. This view targets both diaspora Jewish communities and the Jewish state, such that Israel is seen as a white-passing colonialist power against whom any form of so-called resistance is justified. Propagators of all 3 poisonous worldviews use the internet and social media to great effect, spreading their venom virally and globally at the speed of a click and rapidly radicalizing thousands. It is important to remember that each of these ideologies pose a threat to all of us, to our pluralistic societies and democratic values. These are destructive movements whose goal is to dismantle fundamental aspects of our civilization. At stake, therefore, in this fight is not only the future of the global Jewish community, but the very survival of modern Europe and America as we define it today. Rather than dwell further on the extent of the problem, allow me respectfully to propose 7 tangible measures that, if implemented, would go a long way to reversing this terrible trend. First, the United States should encourage our European allies to subsidize the cost of security for Jewish communities. Static security personnel for synagogues and Jewish schools is an essential measure, especially now. Some European governments partially subsidize that cost, for example, the United Kingdom. Many others do not. U.S. diplomats should press our allies to help defray reasonable costs of their Jewish community security requirements. Second, Europe must correct the hostile climate in its universities. Student leaders in multiple European countries reported to me that the price Jewish students must pay for physical safety on campus is their complete divorce from Zionism and the State of Israel. It should go without saying that it is anti-Semitic to coerce Jews to forego aspects of their Jewish identity, including Zionism. Since October 7th, the campus climate has become dramatically worse. 30 days after the massacre, the European Union of Jewish Students reported a horrendous increase in anti-Semitism. Even university officials have been a source of the poison. For example, the trade union for the staff of University College London passed a motion calling for a mass uprising against Israelis and, quote, intifada until victory. These are university officials. Widespread anti-Semitism in educational institutions is doubly dangerous in that it produces the next generation of anti-Semites while inculcating fear in the next generation of Jews. U.S. officials can apply pressure here. Third, we should work with our allies to implement the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Europe has been a leader in adopting the definition, but for it to be effective, it must be implemented. For example, by incorporating it into the training of law enforcement personnel and university administrators, and by employing it as a teaching tool in schools. We should work with our allies to do that. I want to take a moment to thank Congressman Lawler of this committee, who's been a leader in adoption of the IRA definition. Fourth, European countries should refuse to harbor militant Islamists. A moderate French imam recently called for the deportation of all militant Islamists who are not citizens of France, and France has previously expelled several radical imams. Militant Islamist populations are a threat to everyone. European governments would be wise to act in exercising their legal authority. Fifth, we should hold our allies accountable for casting consistently anti-Israel or pro-Iran United Nations votes. Some European countries repeatedly vote in favor of overtly anti-Israel resolutions. Just last week, the United States cast the lone vote at the Security Council to veto a one-sided resolution. We are grateful to the Biden administration for doing the right thing here. We should follow up by pressuring, punishing, or publicly challenging countries whose UN voting record reflects enduring hostility to the Jewish state. Sixth, we should devote resources to countering the torrents of hate on the internet and on social media while complying with First Amendment values. Seventh, and finally, we should work with European countries to combat anti-Semitism proactively through philo-Semitism. No war has ever been won only by playing defense. Going on the offense means proactively inculcating an understanding and appreciation of the history of the Jewish people and the values of Judaism that have played a central role in the development of the rest of the West. Here, thanks to bipartisan congressional authorization, every May is presidentially declared to be Jewish American Heritage Month. The United States can play a central role in globalizing the practice of Jewish Heritage Month. Members, these 7 measures do not exhaust the list of what may be done, but they represent actions that will likely produce far-reaching results. If we focus on achievable steps, I'm confident that we can roll back this scourge and build the better and more just world that our children and grandchildren so richly deserve. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. I now recognize Rabbi Cooper for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Kean, and I appreciate also the opening statement from Ranking Member Keating. As the only rabbi on the panel, I'm going to try to do my best to be non-rabbinic and stick to 5 minutes. So as a result, the statistics that are all shocking, some of which previous speakers already outlined, we'll also hear from someone who's based in Europe. But I just want also, as a word of caution, in Germany, a study by the University of Bielefeld shows that only 1/4 of anti-Semitic acts of hate crimes were reported by the victims. So if the BKA listed 4,400 crimes in Germany from October 7th to December 11th, we can be pretty sure the majority of those incidents were linked to the Hamas war and targeted the Jewish population. 2 weeks ago, I was at the OFEC Counseling Center in Berlin. Professionals do the intake from the Jewish community. They are completely overwhelmed. They were then, from October 7th to December 6th, 647 requests from the Jewish community for help. There is a grand total of about 250,000 Jews in all of Germany. So the situation there is quite overwhelming. And I would also say, while we certainly welcome the idea of anti-Semitism czars or monitors across Germany, led by Felix Klein, very, very well-suited person, we've also had to call out 2 of those czars for their anti-Semitism, Michael Blume, as well as Gerhard Urlich, who, instead of backing the Jewish community, have made statements that have actually legitimized Jewish hatred. But let me go directly to a list of suggested recommendations that could be applicable to all countries in Europe. Number 1, the safety of Jewish residents. We need to implement enhanced measures, including increased surveillance to ensure the physical safety of Jews in Europe. And yes, it's come to that in many locations. Secondly, when necessary, relocation support. Provide support for Jews in high-risk areas to relocate to safer locations. Number 3, hate crimes legislation. Enact stronger hate crime laws with stiffer penalties to deter anti-Semitic acts. There are many, many rules and laws that are on the books in Europe, but clearly the enforcement and the penalties need to be stiffer because we're facing a tsunami. Number 4, detention and deportation of illegal Islamist operatives. Detain or deport operatives of illegal Islamist entities such as Hamas and Hezbollah, and all of whom commit, as we know, serious acts of anti-Semitism. Number 5, it's important for countries like Germany, but not only, to establish partnerships for receiving back rejected asylum seekers. Number 6, which is already actually underway in at least one of the states in Germany, one of the prerequisites for citizenship is the recognition of Israel, require recognition of Israel's right to exist, and make a commitment against anti-Semitism for all immigrants seeking citizenship in the Western democracies, and also be in a position to revoke citizenship of dual citizens who commit serious anti-Semitic acts. Number 7, and this is specifically for Europe, online hate speech monitoring. Develop and implement strategies to monitor and combat online hate speech, especially on social media, collaborating with tech companies to degrade the marketing of such hate and eventually remove such content. Number 8, and I probably hear it from each of the speakers, set and enforce guidelines against anti-Semitism on university campuses. The right to free speech must not include calls for genocide of Jews or physical violence against Jews. Number 9, empower law enforcement to enforce existing laws more stringently. 2 weeks ago, when I was in Berlin, I met with the head of the largest police unions and 200,000 members. They are asking for more guidance, for more education, and for more signals from the political establishment about making sure they could move against demonstrations that feature symbols of terrorist groups like Hamas or ISIS and chants of anti-Jewish slogans. In order to do that, law enforcement personnel have to be educated about the pernicious impact of anti-Semitism, and they must be instructed by the political establishments, left, right, and center, to enforce the law more stringently. Number 10, develop a coherent asylum policy that permits entrance of individuals after approval. Asylum seekers across Europe must not automatically receive permission to stay until a decision regarding their status is clarified and completed. Number 11, I didn't know I'd be sitting next to the world's expert, but I'll just say freeze and disrupt Islamist funding infrastructure. Destruct the financial networks of entities like Hamas and Hezbollah that are linked especially to Turkish and Qatari banks. Cease foreign funding of mosques and of the training of imams. We need collectively to prevent mosques from receiving overseas funding that enables external influences. Monitor mosques systematically for anti-Semitic rhetoric and act decisively in the case of violations. Holocaust and Israel education. I'll just say, there are 3 or 4 different areas, but the most important part would be, as Ilan Carr just said, we want to educate young people in Europe about the core values of the Jewish people, not just don't hate a particular group. And when it comes to the commemoration of the Holocaust, on either side of the Atlantic, I think we've reached a point that we should only attend the memorial programs for dead Jews with people in institutions who show respect and concern for live Jews. I say that as the Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a leading institution devoted to the teaching of the lessons of the Holocaust. And 2 more points. We need to do away with UNRWA. You might say, what does UNRWA have to do with anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States? It's very simple. If nearly 90% of the people in Gaza backed October 7th, these are people who grew up and went to school in UNRWA schools. They were taught not peace curricula, but war curricula. And so we need to do away with UNRWA and begin to treat Palestinians as adults, put the money in escrow, create systems in which they can control their own educational systems, but in a way in which the donor nations can actually see what's being taught. And finally, besides, of course, supporting the Abraham Accords, we must make sure that every European country designates the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Cooper. I now recognize Dr. Levitt for his opening statement.
Chairman Kean, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and discuss the potential terrorist implications of the sharp rise in anti-Semitism in Europe. I want to say what an honor it is in particular to appear on this panel with the people sitting to my right and my left. Last week, I visited Israel and saw firsthand the horrific results of the massacre Hamas carried out targeting Israeli communities on October 7th. I bore witness, a term we really haven't used since the Holocaust, to what is left of Kfar Aza and the atrocities Hamas executed there. Hamas has vowed to, quote, repeat the October 7 attack time and again until Israel is annihilated, end quote, which explains why Israel is fighting to dismantle the Hamas governance project in Gaza and deny the group the ability to carry out such attacks in the future. This war, which Israel did not start and did not want, was the war Hamas always wanted. What Hamas could not have anticipated is that even after carrying out such a brutal attack, the group would enjoy vocal support in pockets of anti-Semitic protests around the world, including in Europe and the United States. Most protesters are rallying against the war and casualties in Gaza, but an alarming number protest Israel's right to exist, praise Hamas and the October 7th attacks. An alarming number have crossed from protesting Israeli actions to targeting Jews in general. In the most recent case, a 16-year-old was arrested in Austria for trying to procure a weapon to attack a Vienna synagogue, as if that will create a Palestinian state. As a result, Israel's National Security Council issued a travel warning for over a dozen countries, including the UK, France, and Germany, warning Israeli citizens to take additional precautions while traveling in those countries. That's the reality for Israelis and Jews around the world today. These anti-Semitic incidents create an echo chamber which rationalizes and legitimizes violence targeting Israelis, Jews, and anyone seen as supporting them. Taken together, this anti-Semitism creates an environment ripe for increased terrorism. Consider, for example, the rise in the use of hate speech and symbols, threats and intimidation and violence at these protests. A number of protesters have displayed overtly pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic symbols at pro-Palestinian protests. German police broke up a pro-Hamas celebration led by Samidun, a front organization for the U.S. and EU-designated Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which Germany has since banned from operating in the country. The use of hate speech and anti-Semitic imagery not only perpetuates the virulent hatred that fueled Hamas's attack on Israel, but can and does result in acts of real-world violence against Israeli and Jewish targets worldwide. Ilka Salmi, the European Union counterterrorism coordinator, recently noted his concern that the Gaza crisis is producing tensions in Europe which could lead to polarization, which could then in turn lead to terrorism in Europe. In the days following the October 7th attack, a number of Hamas and other terrorist leaders called for protests around the world. Khalid Mishal, for example, a senior Hamas official currently residing in Qatar, called for a day of rage. This sparked widespread fear around the world, particularly in Jewish communities. Here in the United States and in the UK, for example, Jewish schools closed their doors. Children of Israeli diplomats were warned not to attend public schools for their own safety. Some protesters have adopted radical pro-Palestinian symbols and slogans, from the river to the sea, a phrase that by the definition calls for eradication of the state of Israel, not the creation of a Palestinian state. Demonstrators here in Washington insisted that Palestinians should resist Israel, quote, by any means necessary, a phrase which condones the use of terrorism. In the weeks since October 7th, a variety of terrorist organizations have issued calls for violence. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula released a statement calling on Muslims everywhere to target and kill every Jew, American, and British citizen. Far-right neo-Nazi groups have done the same. Accelerationist groups have done the same. The German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution found that October 7th galvanized a wide variety of extremist groups based in Germany, from the far left to the far right, as groups from both ends of the ideological spectrum took to social media to spread disinformation and advocate expressly for violent action. The most pressing security challenge in the West, in the U.S. and in Europe both, to emerge from October 7th and the resulting war is the threat of inspired plots and lone actor terrorism. The FBI director has warned of this. European officials, including EU Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson, have warned of this. And while many people associate the tactic of inspiring lone actors and small groups to carry out acts of terrorism with Sunni jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State alone, Iran and its proxies have actively created online networks aimed at inspiring Shia jihadist attacks as well. In a report discussing the emergence of lone Shia actors in the United States several years ago, the National Counterterrorism Center described the occurrence of a catalyzing event as one key risk factor they're looking for that could lead to an increase in lone actor terrorist attacks from Shia extremists. October 7th certainly qualifies as such an event, which, compounded by the staggering increase in anti-Semitism across the globe, has inspired terrorist groups to mobilize their followers to violence. Earlier this year, I co-authored a Washington Institute study with Mustafa Ayad, the Executive Director for Africa and the Middle East and Asia at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which dug into Iranian efforts to inspire Shia homegrown violent extremist attacks. This has created a variety of networks and websites, echo chambers spanning various digital platforms, championing martyrdom as something noble, theologically sanctioned, and could potentially participate real-world harm, especially in the wake of the October 7th attacks. This all is true, especially true given the staggering spike in anti-Semitism around the world. as Ilka Salmi, the EU counterterrorism coordinator, notes, I think there is a possibility that pro-Palestinian demonstrations, notably unauthorized ones, could give rise to violence against real or perceived supporters of Israel, including Jewish citizens and their institutions. EU member state governments should do all they can to protect European Jews from such violence. The reality is that they have their work cut out for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. I now recognize Ms. Rodan Benzaken for her opening statement.
Chairman Kean, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the scourge of anti-Semitism in Europe today. As director of AJC's 8 European offices and with a very diverse background from across Europe, I can attest that although contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe has been a problem for at least 2 decades, the terrorist programs of October 7th have marked a significant turning point. We have seen an explosion of anti-Semitic hate crimes across the continent. As an example, Germany reported a 320% increase. In Britain, anti-Semitic incidents quintupled in the month following October 7th. And France saw almost 4 times the total reported acts since October 7th than in all of 2022. It is as if a deep-seated anti-Semitic passion has been unleashed on October 7th without shame. Consequently, many European Jews live in fear, adopting strategies to conceal their Jewish identity. An AJC survey conducted before October 7th had already shown that 1 in 3 French Jews avoided showing any outward sign of their Jewishness. Since October 7th, it has become increasingly common for Jews to remove mezuzot and even alter Jewish-sounding names on doorbells and delivery apps to avoid being targeted. Before and since October 7th, different distinct manifestations could be observed. A far-left anti-imperialist post-colonial faction epitomized by figures like former British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and French far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who have demonized Israel, Zionism, and even Jewish institutions and individuals. Their narrative enables anti-Semitism to be cloaked in the guise of anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and even anti-fascism, resulting in the exclusion and targeting of Jews. They are tied to and have tried to appeal to a second tier, anti-Zionist and often ideologically radicalist elements within Muslim communities, some of whom we have seen in the streets of London, Berlin, Stockholm, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, far-right populists, while some are claiming to protect Jews, often maintain a certain ambiguity, never fully distancing themselves from white nationalists, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, continue to engage in historical revisionism. Even just today, as we are speaking, a far-right Polish member of parliament extinguished in an outrageously anti-Semitic gesture a Hanukkah menorah with a fire extinguisher in the Polish parliament. As has been the case in the past, these sources often merge. Since October 7th, our own internal AJC studies have shown a notable increase in pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic content on social media, propagated not only by Islamists and radical pro-Palestinian, but also by far-left and even far-right social media accounts. In response, most European governments have shown commendable action, particularly in protecting Jewish sites. But more needs to be done. The first step involves establishing a very clear zero-tolerance policy, applicable in all settings, from universities to the streets to social media. Europe has indeed very strong hate crime laws. These include the social media space, in particular since the EU has voted the Digital Services Act, or the DSA, which imposes significant obligations on social media platforms. But the situation still has not improved because more needs to be done to actually apply the law. Second, it is crucial for governments and policymakers to address all forms of anti-Semitism without turning it into a political ballgame. Too frequently, anti-Semitism is treated as a political weapon, with the right and left blaming each other, which only serves to worsen the problem rather than resolving it. Third, anti-Semitism is not about Jews. It is never about Jews. It is about the surrounding society or the culture or the country. It is an early warning system, a sign that the society itself is breaking down. According to our own AJC survey, 73% of French and Germans believe that anti-Semitism is indeed not the problem of Jews, but of society as a whole. But little is being done by governments and policymakers to actually help translate this into policy. Fourth, a crucial strategy in combating anti-Semitism involves a transformative approach to education, including by understanding that certain fringe ideologies like post-colonialism and postmodernism in universities have allowed anti-Semitism to thrive. Education ministries and universities need to make sure that educational systems actually encourage open dialogue and critical thinking rather than ideologies. And finally, addressing both the symptoms and root causes of anti-Semitism is essential. This means confronting external and internal forces that exploit societal weaknesses. Countries like Qatar, Iran, China, Turkey, and Russia wage to various degrees a covert war against the West, often promoting anti-Semitism. They use media outlets, fund political parties, universities, religious institutions, and deploy social media bots to sow division. The Times reported that half of dozen UK-based groups with direct ties to Tehran were active in pro-Palestinian marches in London, displaying Iranian propaganda. Germany recently raided the Iranian-linked Islamic Center in Hamburg. Yet, neither the EU nor the UK have designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, despite the fact that it has posed a direct and immediate threat to Jewish communities. And as for Hezbollah, an artificial distinction between the so-called military and political branch in the EU is still kept. The Stars of David that were found in Paris after the October 7th attacks were ultimately linked to Russia's doppelganger network. And while Europe has shut down Russia today after Russia invaded Ukraine, Al Jazeera and AJ Plus continue to disseminate problematic content. And internally, policymakers must tackle the issue that fuels extremism by promoting responsible, democratic debate and actually fostering a culture of compromise. Combating anti-Semitism effectively requires a comprehensive effort from the entire society. It is imperative for Europe, but also for America, to actually wake up. We are engaged in a civilizational battle. If we fail to overcome it, we risk the destruction of the world as we know it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rodan Benzaken. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank each of you for your extraordinarily powerful testimony here today. Mr. Carr, when you served in the State Department under the Trump administration, you had insight into the roles that our nation's adversaries played in stoking anti-Semitism across the globe, including in Europe. What can you tell us about Russia's efforts to deepen anti-Semitic divides in Europe, and what are Russia's objectives in doing so?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. Russia's efforts in these regards are extensive, deep and wide. Russia primarily employs anti-Semitic agitation in its neighbors, not so much because President Putin himself has made anti-Semitism a focus of his leadership within Russia, but rather as a form and weapon to destabilize neighboring countries and to allow Russia then to claim that these neighboring countries are fascist and therefore need to be denazified or somehow cleaned of fascist and anti-Semitic tendencies. During a particular uptick in anti-Semitism in Poland, as measured on the social media, Ambassador Mosbacher at the time and I met in Moscow about this, and it was determined by our embassy that a substantial portion of anti-Semitic posts on social media in Polish were done by bots and suspected to be of Russian origin. There is no question with regard to Ukraine that not only anti-Semitic posts on social media, but actual anti-Semitic attacks, vandalisms, various anti-Semitic agitation and foment, even leading to physical violence, were performed by Russian allies within Ukraine. Now, this is not to say that there isn't anti-Semitism in Poland and Ukraine. There certainly is. There's anti-Semitism everywhere, as we know, sadly. But there is little doubt and incontrovertible proof that Russia is engaged in an active campaign of anti-Semitic agitation among its neighbors, especially the neighbors that President Putin regards as hostile to Russian interests.
And can you please describe Iran's efforts to promote anti-Semitism?
Iran, as you correctly and powerfully pointed out in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, is the world's chief state sponsor of both terrorism and anti-Semitism. It is an exporter of anti-Semitism throughout the world. It is funding anti-Semitic movements and anti-Semitic agitation in multiple countries. Through Hezbollah, its terrorist proxy in Lebanon, Lebanese schools are awash with anti-Semitic sewage of the worst kind, indoctrinating children to hate Jews and to devote themselves to martyrdom, much as we've seen in the schools of Hamas and in UNRWA textbooks, as Rabbi Cooper correctly pointed out. This now extends to Latin America, where Iran and Hezbollah both have substantial networks and are promoting destabilization in those countries and actually terrorism in those countries. And so Iran is a leading source of anti-Semitic foment. And by the way, it is important to note that Iran's chief defense of its malevolent conduct is that it's not anti-Semitic at all, but merely anti-Zionist. And this, by the way, should teach all of us a lesson about this false distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. It's really quite simple. And to try to nuance that is to do a deep disservice to the fight against anti-Semitism. And Iran is an anti-Semitic country, the regime, I should say. The Iranian rogue regime is an anti-Semitic regime. And incidentally, when it took power, one of the first things that Iran did is execute the leader of the Iranian Jewish community. And its anti-Semitism has continued unabashed, unchecked, and unconstrained every year since its murder of the leader of Iran's Jewish community, which is one of the many reasons why Iranian mischief is a threat to global Jewry, to peace and stability in the world, to the United States. And I very much hope that the recent disasters that we've seen in the world will lead the United States to reevaluate its Iran policy and really bring people together around a strong policy to contain the mischief of one of the world's most dangerous regimes.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Dr. Levitt, Iran and its proxies in Lebanon, Gaza, and elsewhere are leading exporters of anti-Semitic hate and violence. Additionally, the IRGC has helped plan attacks against Jewish communities in Europe. Do Hamas and Hezbollah derive financing or support from Europe? And what could be done, what more could be done by the European governments to block this support, and how can the U.S. help?
Thank you for the question. Both Iran and Hezbollah get a tremendous amount of money, plus weapons, intelligence, and other support directly from Iran. But they both also fundraise in Europe. And just today, there is a meeting in Europe, and the U.S. government is represented there in an effort to build together a task force to more productively and proactively target Hamas financing in Europe. This is to complement an effort that's already been going for a few weeks now, post-October 7th, involving U.S. Treasury's FinCEN, our financial intelligence unit, and the financial intelligence unit in Israel and elsewhere, several in Europe. To do this, it's incredibly important because In the case of Hamas in particular, Hamas's budget got more money from its control of the Gaza Strip over the past few years than any other source, even including the amount of money it got from Iran. To the extent that the Israelis successfully end the Hamas governance project in the Gaza Strip, they will lose access to those hundreds of millions of dollars, and they will therefore be even more reliant on things like abuse of charity, which is happening in Europe as we speak. Hezbollah has a much bigger budget and is a much bigger threat. It also engages in abuse of charity around the world, including in Europe. But its criminal activities in Europe are extremely important. And we have been having, over at least the past 2 administrations, much more law enforcement cooperation from the Europeans than we've had in the past. But as you've heard from my colleagues, it's going to be exceptionally important going forward to build on that, to get all of Hezbollah, not just the quote-unquote terrorist wing designated within the European Union, to get the IRGC designated within the European Union and within the UK.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. And Rabbi Cooper, you and Ms. Vodin Ben-Zaken both mentioned the fact that the EU has no tolerance laws on the books, but there are, we need to stand up against hate crimes and on definitions, the monitoring of online hate speech and online anti-Semitism, and ensuring that law enforcement has the tools necessary. Can either of you be a little bit more specific in some of the things that we need to do in that regard?
Well, if you allow me just to start, I can tell you that I'll be in Berlin again tomorrow, and we're going to be pursuing a relationship with the police, people who trained the trainers. Our Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles has already trained over 200,000 law enforcement, domestically and overseas. So we can add to that, but really the most important element everywhere is a signal from the political establishment that anti-Semitism is important. So for example, as we know, the challenges from terrorism and the targeting of Jews in France goes back to the Joe Goldenberg massacre in the 1980s. It's not a new phenomenon. But in recent decades, I think we have to give the police in France pretty good grades for doing their job. But the judicial system in France refuses to even put the murderers of elderly Jewish women permanently in jail, let alone hold others culpable if they come from the bottom of the socioeconomic range. A lot of politics and ideology seep into the judicial system so that French Jews don't have a confidence in the system. In Germany, there are a lot of laws on the books, but as one example about Iran's kind of nefarious influence, they created a holiday from, a Muslim holiday from whole cloth called Al-Quds Day, which is about taking back Jerusalem from the Jewish people and having the Muslim world control. And the demonstrations that took place on the streets of German cities, year after year, despite our protestations and other Jewish organizations, that was the first time since the Hitler era in which death to the Jews was chanted in Germany. That was a seed, a poison seed that was planted by the Iranians, and it's taken this long for Germany and other countries to wake up to it. And I think as long as we're talking about it as well, let's remember that Iran is a state that sponsors, that pushes the denial of the Shoah, Holocaust denial. It doesn't stop them from using Holocaust imagery to demonize Jews in the Jewish state and to mock the victims of the Holocaust. But when you have the full power of the state behind a big lie, as we know from, tragically, from our Jewish history, terrible things can happen. And we live in an era today in which everything local is global and everything global is local. So whether it's Al Jazeera from Qatar or Al-Manar from Hezbollah, using their substantial reach into the Arab and Muslim world. They're the ones who are getting that poison opportunity to spread that poison seed across European societies and democracies. And I would just say in terms of Germany, for example, the focus really needs to be on the younger people, the children of the immigrants, to try to reach them and explain to them in the 21st century why, as a citizen of Germany, it's important for them to understand what happened in the Nazi Holocaust and what steps as good citizens they need to embrace in order to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Thank you. Ms. Vodan-Bizaken?
I mentioned earlier on the need for a zero-tolerance policy. There are indeed great laws in Europe, across the European continent, and far more stringent laws than here in the United States. But one of the big problems, as was just mentioned, was that they are not really always applied, and this absolutely needs to change. There is, when you create a feeling of impunity, when people have the impression that they can basically say or do whatever they want, this only creates further anti-Semitic acts. And so it absolutely starts with the social media. Under the DSA, so under the Digital Services Act that was voted by last year by the European Union, social media platforms have an obligation of transparency and have an obligation to remove content when it contravenes European laws. Despite the fact that there is such a huge amount of anti-Semitic content online, the social media companies are today not really obliged. So they will get a letter from the European Commissioner alerting them about the situation, but there are no real consequences. There are no real consequences in terms of financial consequences, and there are no real consequences in terms of potentially being shut down at some point. So there needs to be a very clear message to social media companies that they have a responsibility. We know that the path between words and beliefs and actual acts exist. We know it because we have experienced it in the past here in the United States and even in New Zealand and of course in Europe, where we know that people have become radicalized online, people have expressed their anti-Semitism, their racism, their radicalization online, and then have actually acted upon it. So there absolutely needs to be a very clear zero-tolerance strategy, especially because we have seen that when things are being done, they bear results. I'll give you one example. France was one of the only countries that at the very beginning, after October 7th, because it had experienced times where there were horrible anti-Semitic acts in times whenever Israel was facing Hamas, decided to shut down anti-Semitic, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrations in the streets of Paris, Marseille, and elsewhere. And it produced results. When you look today at the world, including here in the United States, France is probably one of the only countries where you have very little anti-Semitic demonstrations in the streets of France. So whenever the country actually sends out a very clear message that there are consequences when people behave in an illegal way, it works. So my recommendation is and has been to European governments to actually use the laws that they have and just apply them.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Keating for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to all our witnesses, there was one common thread that came about that I think really underscores an important point. Some of the comments revolved around that anti-Semitism is an early warning system for breakdowns, that it's a sign of societal weakness in countries, that it's being used in many ways. And I think there's important point here, that how anti-Semitism is being used, too, as a political weapon in these authoritarian versus democratic fights that we find out throughout Europe. Of course, it's happening globally, but particularly in Europe, since this is our subject matter. And I was wondering just what your comments are on this, because we've seen time and time again, even in a parliamentary system, it has, I think, even more leverage, because as there are attempts to constitute a government after elections and put coalitions together, many times the more extreme coalitions are necessary to tip the scales, and there's an embracement of some of these more extreme coalitions. And within those coalitions, I've observed myself, and I think many of you have referenced that, that anti-Semitism finds its way threading through in sometimes overt ways, sometimes more subtle ways, but it's there. Could you take a moment to comment on how anti-Semitism is being used as a political weapon as well, and something not just on domestic countries' political systems, but also how it's being used by countries like Iran and like Russia, often through social media and other ways, sparking violence and other discord as a weapon from the outside politically to influence political realities in countries, and how this ties into democratic backsliding. Because I do believe, in my observations, and I think it's probably clearly the truth, that in authoritarian type of coalitions that are put together, it's more prevalent. And the result is attacking democracies. And since we've seen some democratic backsliding in Europe, can you comment on, number one, how this can be used and how you've observed it being used to influence political outcomes, elections, and how it's used by authoritarian types of coalitions versus democracies?
Ranking Member Keating, let me be I'll jump in. I'll be the canary in the coal mine in this one, for starters, if you will. Our namesake, Simon Wiesenthal, of blessed memory, he was a victim of the Nazis. He lost, together with his wife, 89 members of their family, and he spent the rest of his life fighting to rehabilitate the basic concepts of justice. And I was honored to know and work together with him and Rabbi Marvin Heyer for 29 years until he passed. He said a very important thing. He said, where democracy is strong, it's good for Jews, and where it's weak, it's bad for Jews. And he didn't learn that lesson at university. He learned it from real life. I think your point about the coalitions is very well taken, especially if we look, for example, at Germany, which right now has a coalition that includes the Greens and the right wing, and it's right now fairly stable. But every German member of the Bundestag I've spoken to, and every member of the media, the AfD comes up in every conversation. That is a political party in which, let's just say, the far right feels very, very comfortable with. And it would seem that in the coming years, when there'll be further elections, if they gain traction and even get a small number of seats, you can wake up one morning and find an AfD in a coalition government in Germany. That's not going to be good for the Jews of Germany. It's not going to be good for democracy. But I think it's also worth noting, just to understand that we're dealing with fairly sophisticated racists and bigots. You remember that the first protests against the COVID vaccines took place in the streets of Germany. And at those seemed to be ad hoc, with thousands and thousands of people who felt, so worried, so betrayed, not knowing enough information. In the midst of those protests were neo-Nazis, and their visual aids and flags and symbols were right there in the middle, even though the basic core questions that people had, not just in Germany, were legitimate. you see a tried and true effort of always trying to infiltrate the mainstream. So what's changed between Simon Wiesenthal growing, young person in the 1930s and today? Social media. Social media gives the opportunity for the most extreme groups and views to present themselves in a mainstream context when, in fact, what they're really, you might say, it's the wolf in sheep's clothing. And just one last thing that also Mr. Wiesenthal taught us. I remember a question a university student asked him. He said, Mr. Wiesenthal, it's in 1980. Can the Holocaust happen again? And his answer was amazing. He said, if you have a situation where you have an organized group of haters, a social crisis, plus technology, anything is possible. Of course, he was talking about the technology that he experienced in the 30s and 40s. Didn't know anything about an internet. And what he said was, if the technology of his day had been available in 1492, no Jew would have survived in Spain, no Catholic would have survived in England, and no Protestant would have survived in France.
Ms. Benzikin, could you also, you referenced some of the things I mentioned in your testimony. Could you expand on that, please?
So first of all, I agree that, and as I mentioned earlier on, that anti-Semitism is always the canary in the coal mine. It is when we see it that we know that a society is falling apart, which, by the way, is also the reason why since 2015, I started to recognize that anti-Semitism was starting to come here to the United States and publicly warned about it. The way that politicians, in particular in Europe, have used anti-Semitism as a political tool is very important. When you look at, for example, the far left in France, there is a clear political objective to appeal to certain populations, actually by stigmatizing them to some extent, because the far left politicians like Jean-Luc Mélenchon believe that all Muslims are basically anti-Semites. So what he is trying to do is basically to have a discourse that he believes will appeal to them. He appeals indeed to the radical part of it. He doesn't appeal, thankfully, to all of them. But that is a clear political strategy. That's the first part. The second part of his strategy, and the strategy of the far left in France, is to create basically constantly a conflict in society, and he uses Jews, Israel, and Zionism to create that conflict constantly. And he actually creates a situation where the far right is becoming more important and bigger, because his objective and the objective of the far left is not necessarily to win the next presidential elections, but to make sure that the far left is the only opposition party to the far right, and that the far right will actually be winning the elections, so that we find ourselves in a situation where you only have the far right and you only have the far left, and the moderates in the center are falling apart. So that's the way he has been using it. But there are also of course, examples where, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, where anti-Semitism is also used as a political tool, and you mentioned earlier on Hungary, for example, where historical revisionism is used to create a sense of national pride, where the idea is to say, we have not really been so wrong. We are, in the end, a country that can ultimately be entirely proud of itself. In order to do so, they are revising the history and the roles by some individuals during the Second World War are revising their role. That has been the case, of course, in Hungary, but also in Poland, where, for example, any criticism of Poland and the Polish past would have been criminalized. So, in particular, in Central and Eastern Europe, again, the role of Jews has become central in the way the political game is played. But the third point I would like to mention, and I've mentioned it earlier on in my introductory remarks, because I think they're absolutely key, is there is a real danger in making anti-Semitism a political game. There is such a tendency, in particular in the European continent, to see politicians always cry out when anti-Semitism is happening on the other side, but never on their own. There is never any introspection to say, you know what, maybe we have a problem in our political side. And that makes the issue of anti-Semitism, not only does it not solve it, but it really exacerbates the problem. And it places Jews and the Jewish communities in an extremely fragile position, because they are basically basically the ball that is being played with by both sides of the political spectrum.
Great, and as I yield back, Mr. Chairman, it's just great to listen to that testimony and mention and hear what Rabbi Cooper and Ms. Radon Benzikin said. I'm sure the other witnesses would have time, but maybe you will with other members. But to see that amplified not only by social media, but by outside forces, particularly Russia, who's interfering in elections, not only in this country, but all through Europe, and to see how they're using this, this hatred to try and cause disruption to their own political advantage. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I now recognize Mr. Lawler from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Tomorrow, the House Foreign Affairs Committee is planning to mark up my bill, the IGO Anti-Boycott Act. While existing laws already disincentivizes other countries from boycotting Israel, this bill would disincentivize IGOs, like the UN and EU, from supporting BDS efforts. This is long overdue, and I look forward to moving this critical legislation through the committee. What does the BDS movement look like today in Europe and across other allied countries and IGOs around the world?
Sure. First of all, thank you for your efforts and for your bill. It's very important. As the person here today to kind of make the connection between what's happening and the anti-Semitic rise in terrorism, I just want to point out that an overwhelming number of entities in Europe that are the engines for BDS are fronts for terrorist organizations. If you look just, for example, at Samidoun, which I mentioned earlier, affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, if you look at some of the Hamas front organizations, what BDS has become is the public, legitimate face of anti-Israel activity. This is the way that you can engage in anti-Israel behavior and pretend that what you're doing is within the law. It's typically the public-facing side of what these entities and individuals are doing, and then there's other things that they're doing behind closed doors. But it's not simple and well-intentioned and just trying to get Israel to change certain behaviors. It ultimately is about trying to end Israel.
If I can add, and to first of all say, Congressman, thank you for all your efforts, not just within the committee, but on BDS and how it links up to the issue here of anti-Semitism. Our researchers at the Wiesenthal Center, I think, came up with, when you think about it, becomes obvious, but it's worth just stating it. Remember SodaStream? That was the first major global blowout. And when you heard the BDS proponents saying, oh, no, this is not about Israel. This is about the occupied territories and the fact that SodaStream has its factory in the occupied areas And if they just move it, that'll be the end of the problem. When it was explained that there'd be 50 or 60 Palestinian families that no longer have a breadwinner, that Jews and Arabs had exactly the same monetary compensation, couldn't care less. Rule number one about BDS, they don't care about individual Palestinians. Secondly, the next step, not advertised, was now not about a particular spot in the Holy Land, but attacking all of Israel. There you can, I think, go to a certain ice cream brand that was utilized, but there were many other, you might say, more serious examples in which suddenly the state of Israel was demonized, trying to sort of put it into that 20th century South African slot of being a colonializer, an occupier. We know all of the lies. The third step has now then extended outside of Israel to Jews who supported Israel, to Zionists. And now we've landed in the fourth and final level, in which you have, just last Friday night, down the Wilshire Boulevard corridor, demonstrations, protests, following pretty much the narrative of Hamas, with spray paintings in an area that has synagogues and many Jews, especially Persian Jews, living there. So you've seen the evolution between starting out just about occupied territories to where we are today, which is saying that BDS is a legitimizer of anti-Semitism on both sides of the Atlantic, and I commend you again for your efforts.
Thank you. In the short time I have left, Mr. Carr, I recently introduced the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which requires the Department of Education to use the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and its contemporary examples. Can you speak about the importance of the IRA working definition and the importance of having governments adopt it in combating anti-Semitism, especially not just here in the United States, but in Europe and abroad?
Certainly, and actually, I thanked you in my opening remarks as well for your leadership on the IRA issue. Let me just very briefly say about BDS that BDS is nothing other than the modern use of one of the oldest tactics in the book of anti-Semitism, which is denying economic intercourse to the Jewish community, the kind of economic activity that it needs to survive. It's war against Jews by other means, and BDS is the modern iteration of that. It's nothing other than nothing different than brown shirts standing in front of Jewish shops saying, "Don't buy from the Jews, kauft nicht bei Juden." That's what BDS is, and it's very important to recognize it for what it is. With regard to IRA, step one in confronting a threat is understanding the threat. And that means defining what anti-Semitism is. It's not enough to say, you know, I know it when I see it, although we often know it when we see it, but sometimes we don't. And having a definition that is a global standard and an authoritative reference point is deeply important because it allows all of us to discuss Jew hatred from the same playbook. The real power of the IRA definition is in the 11 examples that are including with it. And those examples not only capture traditional, you know, we might call it medieval anti-Semitism, you know, Jews responsible for all maladies in the world, or Jews exhibiting malevolent control over social institutions, but it also captures the so-called new anti-Semitism. And so one of the examples is denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, for example, by saying that the existence of a state of Israel is an anti-Semitic endeavor or a racist endeavor. That's an example. Equating Israel to Nazi Germany is an example. Subjecting Israel to a double standard to which no other democracy is held is an example. Now, what does all this mean? It doesn't mean that we're censoring these things. That's very important. You know, those who don't want anti-Semitism defined will say, well, hold on a minute, there's free speech. Well, of course, there's free speech to call for all kinds of Jew hatred. We're not talking about censorship. The IRA definition is a tool of education. It's a tool of understanding. It's not a tool of censorship. And how can IRA be used? Well, it can be used in training so that, let's say, law enforcement officials understand how to recognize the anti-Semitic motivations underlying hate crimes. Very important. Even we've failed in that. There's an example where an FBI leader, after the Colleyville, Texas attack, said, well, we're not sure this is an anti-Semitic attack. They later walked that back. Why? He meant well. It wasn't an effort to sweep anti-Semitism under the rug. It was that this didn't neatly fit into one of the categories that they understood. The IRA definition would have been deeply important in immediately drawing and understanding that the Colleyville attack of a synagogue was an anti-Semitic attack. IRA is also a deeply important tool in education. Many of our states, as you know, require Holocaust education as a part of the annual curriculum. And we have now the Never Again Education Act that places federal priority on Holocaust education. Well, how can you teach about the Holocaust without talking about Jew hatred, the anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust? And if you're going to teach about anti-Semitism, well, what are you going to teach? What are you going to say? How does it look like? How does it manifest? Well, guess what? We have a global definition that has now been accepted and adopted by over 1,200 entities in the world, including national governments, provincial and state governments, municipal governments, universities, sports teams, NGOs across the world that provides that reference point. So we have it. Let's employ it. Let's use it. Let's adopt it. I'll also point out, by the way, that the IRA definition is bipartisan in terms of our domestic use. It was used in the Obama administration. It was used in the Trump administration. It's being used in the Biden administration. And so it is global. It is bipartisan. And we should be using it because it can make a measurable difference in recognizing this evil that is Jew hatred.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. I now recognize Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, for this important subcommittee hearing. Clearly, it is timely, and we have a lot of challenges, and I think part of the challenge is to figure out how we deal with a strategy that involves not only anti-Semitism that has existed for centuries, but also the politics of hate, the politics of division that, as we know, have been successful. I mean, when President Putin, and it's the contradictions and it's the way the play of words justifies his attack in Ukraine to denazify Ukraine. I mean, with a Jewish president of the country is hard to understand, except when you understand propaganda and when you understand how you manipulate and use people through the divisions of hatred, the divisions of insecurity. 2 weeks ago, I'm a part of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, which is a group of members of the European Parliament and members of Congress, and we meet twice a year. When we sat, and one of our colleagues here on this committee is the chair, Congressman Moran. But when we signed the document concluding our meetings, we stated that there would be, to condemn the sharp rise of anti-Semitism following October 7th attacks by Hamas, called on statements by the European Union to designate Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah in their entirety as terrorist entities. And we went on to do a number of other efforts. I want to try to, Ms. Rodan, when you discussed in your testimony on October 7th, since October 7th, the experience of politicians that have used terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing to describe Israel's military operations against Hamas in Gaza, how is the use of this terms problematic in this context? And can you offer further examples of anti-Semitism disguised as politically critical? Could you explain? Quickly, because I have a limited time.
Sure. I'll go quickly. There have been numerous, and in particular in Spain, governing ministers and politicians who have basically criminalized Israel. It's the demonization of Israel. It is the demonization of Zionism. And it feeds into the whole idea that the Zionist project, that Zionism in itself, that Jews are inherently evil.
No, and that's not new. It goes back to the Inquisition.
It goes back to the Inquisition, and it's
And
the
before.
essence. It is the essence of anti-Semitism. And so, of course, when you have at the highest level politicians, including governing ministers, who hold that kind of speech.
What countries should the United States attempt to place its attention with our foreign ministries to push their governments to do more to combat anti-Semitism? And I know this is a sensitive and delicate subject to name countries.
It is indeed sensitive. In this particular aspect of what I just mentioned, Spain seems important. Other than that, there are a few countries who have not yet adopted the national strategy of anti-Semitism, including, for example, a founding member which starts with B, that's Belgium. So there are a number of countries who have not been doing enough. Again, in particular, look at those. The European Commission has recommended for countries to establish national strategies and special envoys on anti-Semitism. There are a number of countries who have not done so.
One of the other problems that we have, I think we have, is that, in this country, and I think in lots of Europe, we don't teach history anymore, at least in my view. I mean, Wall Street Journal, I don't know how they did the poll, but they determined that about 75% of those supporting the Palestinian individuals, and I think it's horrific what's happening in Palestine and what Hamas is doing. But that aside, they did not know what the river to the sea meant. They didn't know which river and which sea. It just sounded like a good thing that everybody was saying. I mean, when you don't have an education level of what these things mean, it plays on people's fears, it plays on people's hates, and the way the media constructs this whole effort, I think is really cause for us to figure out how we can come together. My time's expired, but this is, Mr. Chairman, an effort that we're going to have to continue. And while we can talk a lot about it, I think what's lacking is trying to come up with a coherent strategy that we can embrace in some fashion that's bipartisan and that really reflects not only our country but our allies in Europe, because we're in this together. I have expended the rest of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. I now recognize Ms. Dean from Pennsylvania.
Hi, thank you, Chairman Kean. Thank you, Ranking Member Keating, for holding this important hearing. And I thank all of our witnesses for giving us your expertise and your experience with what is an incredibly troubling issue here in the United States and letting us know more closely what is going on in Europe. I represent suburban Philadelphia. These issues are extremely important to me and to my constituents. I care deeply about doing everything we can to call out anti-Semitism, as you so eloquently pointed out, because it is a horror in and of itself, but what it does as a precursor to other acts of bigotry and violence is so very troubling. I was wondering if maybe, Rabbi Cooper, you could take a look at pre-October 7th, post-October 7th, and do a comparison contrast United States, Europe, if that's a possibility.
Well, the statistics pre-October 7th were pretty dismal on both sides of the Atlantic.
Correct.
And nothing slowed down the violent anti-Semitism in our shores, not even COVID, not even when synagogues and churches were shuttered. That didn't stop the bigots and the haters and the anti-Semites from those kinds of assaults and attacks. And so when Christopher Wray talks about 63% of the hate crimes targeting 2.4% of the population, he's actually referring to pre-October 7th.
Right.
What really changed on October 7th, which I don't think anyone anticipated, and we're still trying to come to grips with the horror, is two words: yes, but. We've been hearing yes, but on both sides of the Atlantic, shockingly, because as the extent of the brutality, the depth of brutality of October 7th played out. Then remember, the Nazis worked very hard to cover their crimes. Hamas was live streaming their crime. It's almost to this day.
Yes.
I think, everyone in this can't speak for everyone, but I would assume, we assume that people would say, you know what, the Palestinians have to reconfigure what it is they want and what commitment they're going to make to a peaceful future, because what we saw is outside the bounds of humanity. Instead, we heard yes, but. And the reference was made to Spain, to France, where you had, I think, 90% of Jewish students in French universities before October 7th having experienced anti-Semitism. But the change in terms of on the ground in Europe, it's unleashed, I think, pent-up hatred against the Jews. And in this country, led by those who are pushing the Hamas narrative, it's taking anti-Semitism to levels and to depths that we never anticipated.
To depths, such dangerous depths. Ms. Roden Benzaquin, how do I pronounce your name?
Perfectly.
That was okay. I'm a former professor. I taught at LaSalle University in Philadelphia for 10 years, and I was a teacher of writing, rhetoric, argument. But mostly I was a teacher of get your education, get your facts, know what you're talking about. And I'm also about to give a commencement address, and I've been stewing over what to say to these graduates at a local university. I think every one of you spoke about education. What would you say in terms of the importance of education around these issues in order to free us from the ignorance, the veil of ignorance that is so much in the face of this anti-Semitic growth?
Thank you very much. So you're absolutely right. Education is key, and we know, or we've known in Europe for a very long time that we have a problem. Back in the very early years of 2000, for example, there was a book that appeared that was called The Lost Territories of the Republic. And in that book, it was described that in certain schools, the Holocaust could not be taught anymore because students would rebel. Students didn't want to talk about it. In France, Holocaust education is compulsory. And they didn't feel that they had anything related to that. So, 20 years later, of course, this problem has only become bigger. So one of the things I think that is key is to explain and show and demonstrate that what happened then is relevant today, and how hate has changed and what it means for people for young students to actually experience it. It's often seen as something that was in the past. It's often seen as something that is irrelevant to them. But when young people understand that what they are currently seeing, experiencing, is not so different than what happened in the 30s, this is relevant. And I think the way we are teaching right now history, the way we're teaching right now Holocaust education, is not doing that sufficiently in Europe.
Not making that connection. very much appreciate that, and I think we have an obligation as educators to make sure our young people and not so young people know our past, know the world's past. But I think we also have an obligation to call out political leaders who stoke that ignorance, who stoke the language of bigotry, of anti-Semitism. We could talk all day, but I do thank you for all of your work.
Thank you.
I yield back.
May I add something briefly, Mr. Chairman, or not? Is that not permitted?
No, I'm the chair. Thank you, Representative Dean. The chair now recognizes Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carr, you said that some states have programs in their school curriculum about the Holocaust, and that's required by the legislature. That is true for Nevada. In fact, I led that effort in the state legislature some 30 years ago. And in addition to the Jewish groups that supported it, most of the support came from the Nevada Endowment for the Humanities. And it's ironic to me that some people who claim now to be so concerned about anti-Semitism want to defund the Endowment for the Humanities. We need to realize perhaps that ties into the whole education issue of learning about culture and history and people who may not be just like us. And so I just want to put that on the record as we look at that kind of budgeting. But Rabbi Cooper, I wanted to ask you, you said that democracy, when democracy is strong, it's good for Jews. And when democracy is weak, it's bad for Jews. I serve on the House Democracy Partnership, which finds new kind of burgeoning democracies and tries to help to shore them up. Could you give us some suggestions for how we might incorporate this fight against anti-Semitism in our efforts to shore up democracies?
Well, the questions today, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Representative, have been unbelievable. I think each question can be a full session. But I think it was stated before by the people here that when you have anti-Semitism, that's an early warning system that democracy could be under assault. And it's specifically about, I mentioned before about Germany, when the first protest against COVID vaccines came, you had extremists in Germany rushing to the fore to make sure they were in that visual snapshot of the protests, even if it was illegitimate. Look, speaking on behalf of the Wiesenthal Center and our educational law and the Museum of Tolerance, we are deep investors in the concept of democracy. And for us, the concept of democracy is based on personal responsibility and critical thinking. Think about TikTok. It's the exact opposite. It has nothing to do, it's just a matter of playing on your feelings, not on facts. And I think what we have to do collectively, working with the younger generations, is we have to figure out a way how to reach the young people who are only on TikTok, and begin to, you might say, begin to spoon feed some of those basics and say, if you go down this road, this is what happened. We've heard it many times before. It starts with the Jews and never ends with the Jews. Democracy is messy, but paraphrasing Churchill, it's the worst form of government except every other form of government. We need to begin to convince young people that they have a stake in democratic process. It's long, difficult, and messy, but all the other alternatives are dead ends.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'll yield the rest of my time to Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Well, I want to thank Chairman Kean and Ranking Member Keating for allowing me to join this hearing, also for holding this very important hearing. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for your extraordinary testimony today. I have to say, for so many years, we American Jews watched what was happening in Europe, and we felt like how safe we were here and what a shame it was that European Jews had to live with guards outside of their synagogues. And I remember going to visit the synagogue in Florence, wondering what's wrong with this country that they have to have guards outside of their synagogue. Of course, over the past 10 years, that's all changed. And I now have to have guards outside of my synagogue in Greensboro, North Carolina, and have to experience horribly anti-Semitic leaflets being thrown into my driveway. And we have seen over the past 10 years, not just anti-Semitic rhetoric, but we have seen violence, synagogue murders, things we never expected to see in this country. And it's frightening, and it makes American Jews all wonder what the future will bring for us in this country. And of course, we thought that October 7th would shed light on how terrible it is when anti-Semitism and Jew hatred and hatred of Israelis spreads, because what we saw on October 7th was beyond description in its savagery and brutality, and the facts are still coming out. And yet, as the facts come out, there is a hesitancy of people, and I'm going to use it as an example, the UN women, to actually call out violent sexual atrocities that were committed on Israeli women because they're Jews. So I could go on and on about the unfortunate experience that we are having and the fear that has spread among the American Jewish community, as well as a feeling of isolation. I want to get to questions because it's so valuable for us to have all of you expert witnesses here. And Ms. Rodan Benzaquez? Okay.
Rodan is
close
fine.
enough. I want to ask you about an issue that you touched on, but I think requires more conversation. We know anti-Semitism is spread online, within our country and around the globe. And we know that there's no borders to the way online anti-Semitism is spread and inspires individuals and groups to commit acts of hatred against Jews. In the U.S., we seem to be stymied in determining how to stop the spread of anti-Semitism. We seem to be stymied by the First Amendment, and in our unwillingness to hold social media platforms accountable, even though private companies actually aren't bound by the First Amendment, but we seem unwilling to hold social media companies accountable. So it appears that the European countries are more willing to crack down on social media platforms. So what can we learn from them, and what best practices can we learn from how European countries are cracking down on spreading of anti-Semitism online?
Thank you very much for your question. I would also like just to say personally how deeply touched I am to hear your remarks, because for us European Jews, when anti-Semitism started 2 decades ago, the United States was always a safe place. When we thought about where, if things go really sour, where we could go, there was obviously Israel, and then there was the United States. And so to see the anti-Semitism so becoming unleashed really here in the United States in such a short amount of time and to such a huge extent is really unsettling. And it makes European Jews feel even more insecure and even more unsafe. Regarding the issue of anti-Semitism online, as I mentioned earlier on, there are important laws that have been voted in the European Union, in particular the Digital Services Act, but also on national level in several countries. Germany is one example, France is another one, where social media companies have the obligation to remove illicit content when it is being reported, to react in a swift way. Germany is an example where they have 24 hours to remove that content. And to have much more transparency. One of the problems that we've had in the past is that, for example, in terms of content moderation, we had no idea what actually, how many people there were, how many moderators there were, where they were based, how they were trained, what was the basis that they were removing content. Now we know a little bit more. I have to say it's not particularly reassuring. I can tell you that, for example, X in the French-speaking space has a few dozen of moderators in only to remove content. So unfortunately, I can't share best practices because we have the laws, but we don't apply
I
them.
hate to interrupt
What is
you, but
needed
my
is
time is
applying.
long
Sorry.
expired, but I'd love to continue this conversation in another setting, and I yield back. And thank you for allowing me to join this hearing.
I've not wanted to interrupt either the questions or the compelling testimony of the panel before us. There are many members who still want to ask some questions, and I'm going to ask them to put them in writing because there is a menorah lighting at 4:30 on the Capitol steps, as well as votes shortly thereafter. And I want and then therefore I want to thank our witnesses for their valuable testimony and thank the members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional written questions for the witnesses. We ask you to respond to these promptly and in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.